Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard by Thomas Gray. Thomas Gray combines the neoclassical style with the romantic ideals perfectly. He has composed his elegiac poem in iambic pentameter, 4 unstressed and stressed syllables one after another, with a rhyme scheme of ab. The first line rhymes with the third and the second rhymes with the last line of each stanza. This rhyme pattern is classic, and it also follows the pattern of speech in English. Stanzas of 4 lines of iambic pentameter are known as heroic quatrains. In stanza 15, Gray suggests that the common man, who simply by the misfortune of his social class may be unknown, yet in nature he may be as heroic and grand as Hampden, Milton, or Cromwell. It is a nature which provides hope after death. The epitaph, which follows, challenges, too, the classical elegy that is lofty in form and tone as Gray moves from the tightly written style of the formal to the free form of the Romantics, expressing beautifully his humble birth and melancholy that have been lifted by his friendship with Richard West. Now he lies in the repose of death in the bosom of his Father and his God. His grief bridged by friendship in nature. Neoclassical features. Thomas Gray employs the neoclassical use of personification in Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. The pace of iambic pentameter, an unstressed syllable, followed by a stressed syllable 5 times, ta-dum, 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 is dignified. And Gray makes skillful use of monosyllabic words and long vowels. Personification is also a neoclassical trait which Gray utilizes, the boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, and all that beauty, all that wealth e'er gave, awaits alike the inevitable hour. The paths of glory lead but to the grave. Death comes to all, the exalted and the humble. Gray reflects upon the lives of the common people buried in the churchyard, lives spent doing labor with simple enjoyments at the end of the day. Analysis of 3rd stanza. He is saying it is all very quiet and peaceful except for the sound of the owl, who is complaining to the moon about those who disrupt the solitude of her domain. Figures of speech. Thomas Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard contains different figures of speech, poetic or rhetorical devices. Alliteration is the repetition of a consonant sound within a line of poetry. For example, solemn stillness, S sound repeated, glory lead but to the grave, G sound repeated. Personification is the giving of human characteristics to non-human and non-living things. For example, the owl mopes and complains, characteristics, or abilities, which humans possess. Or flattery soothe the dull cold ear of death. Assonance is the repetition of a vowel sound. The repetition of the A sound in the following line is assonance, constorida nor animated bust. Gray's attitude towards the buried, the rich and the poor view on nature with elements of romanticism in his poem. Thomas Gray's first 4 stanzas express a communion of nature with the souls of the dead country people. For instance, the words descriptive of nature, the world to darkness, the solemn stillness of the air, the moping owl, and the mouldering heap of turf in the first 4 stanzas connote death, its darkness, and its immobility. In a further comparison, the lives of the poor country people who are buried in this obscure churchyard have been unfulfilled just as parts of nature are ignored. Similarly, the moping owl, and the flower whose blush is unseen serve to reflect the melancholy meditation of the speaker, who bemoans that not only man, but nature, too, is ignored. Imagining his epitaph, the speaker perceives himself resting his head upon the lap of earth, reposing in the bosom of his Father and his God. At the beginning of the poem, contemplating a life of the dead, the speaker walks through the cemetery at dusk, but when he contemplates the swain remembering the speaker's own life, his wanderings are during the day, and his most energetic action is associated with the sunrise. Life is equated with dawn and death with dusk. However, this is an oversimplification because both dawn and dusk are parts of the overall contemplation of life and death in terms of time. In his epitaph, the speaker wishes to be remembered for such a generous contemplation. Just as he remembers the poor as well as the rich, he asks others to remember him for remembering others. The first stanza describes a scene near the end of the day, signifying sunsetting, the solemn stillness of night, and with the subsequent stanzas, an association with death. In the 17th stanza of Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard by Thomas Gray, the lack of fame and opportunity for the poor is seen as both advantage and disadvantage from different perspectives. Although the humble do not have the scope for the great and glorious deeds that are performed by the powerful and wealthy, neither do they have the opportunity for great sins. This echoes a common Christian notion that, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Although the limited scope for great deeds may seem a misfortune from a worldly point of view, in fact, worldly fame and fortune are not important after death, and thus in the setting of a graveyard, God's giving the humble limited opportunities for committing evil is actually a blessing. At what time of day does the speaker find himself in the country churchyard? The first line of Elegy Written in a Church Courtyard indicates that it is evening. This is when the curfew tolls the bell knell of the parting, sunset day. The first line of the next stanza also notes the glimmering landscape fades, and this means that as the sun sets there is less and less sunlight reflecting, glimmering, off of the land. Line 17, the breezy call of incense-breathing morn, makes it sound like the time has shifted to morning, but this just implies a pun on morning, because he's talking about the forefathers in the grave's lowly bed. Evening is also symbolic of death. This is a common symbol in poetry, the end of a day or the end of a season symbolizing the end of a life. The speaker also stresses the solemn stillness of the evening in line 6, indicating a somber, contemplative, respectful tone. Speaker in Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard is contemplating death. He looks upon the graves in the churchyard and he ruminates on those buried there. It is quite gloomy. A memento mori poem, which means to contemplate one's own mortality. As he considers mortality, the speaker considers what is important to him, and therefore this gloomy poem about death does have its glass is half full interpretation. There is an obvious homage to low classes as they lived honest, simple lives, and a criticism of the extravagance of the lives and memorials of the rich. Therefore, the poem is also the speaker's quest to find himself, or a quest to understand what is important in life. And this is where the epitaph comes in. Most scholars agree that the epitaph is Gray's, or the persona of the speakers. Given the implied modesty in the epitaph, we might assume that it was written by someone else, not the speaker himself. This means that another person is looking at the speaker's death in philosophical contemplation of mortality, just as the speaker himself did throughout the context of the poem. This long poem, a series of stanzas treating various natural phenomena at their ends, and set in a tranquil twilight setting, itself the ending of the day, memorializes the unheralded, unmemorialized lives of everyday beautiful things, unsung beauty that awaits alike the inevitable hour. Much of the beauty of natural things, desert flowers or ocean gems, display their beauty to no audience, no receiver of their beauty. The same is true of the persons lying in a country graveyard, not famous or celebrated, but nonetheless beautiful in their simple rural setting. Originally, in Greek and Roman poetry, the elegy, which is now defined as a poem that laments the death of a friend or a beloved public person, referred just to the meter of a poem, elegiac distiches, and had nothing to do with content. In English literature, following the Greco-Roman model, poets like John Donne used elegy to mean a lyrical poem that could take love and satire as subjects. Although the elegy originally was centered on death and dying, it has become over time the form of any poem whose subject is a solemn meditation on death, the struggles in life, or any momentous subject that the poet discusses in somber, reflective tones, usually with some degree of sorrow and resignation. Thomas Gray treats nature with the utmost respect. According to the poem, nature holds all of mankind at the same level. The speaker considers the fact that in death, there is no difference between great and common people. Based upon this, nature is very different from mankind. Mankind draws lines, makes excuses, and believes itself to be, sometimes, all-powerful. Nature, in the end, has the last say. All will die and return to the ground. At different points throughout the elegy, nature's power is defined. In the first stanza, the end of the day, and leaves the world to darkness, signifies that all work is over. The darkness, ruled by nature, is more powerful than mankind. In the second stanza, the peacefulness of the air and landscape around the speaker dictates the speaker's mood. Later, the complaining owl shows its distaste regarding the fact that her secret bower has been disturbed by mankind. The speaker, throughout the poem, Gray shows his honor of nature by constantly admitting to the power of nature. Therefore, Gray treats nature with the utmost respect, given that nature, unlike mankind, does not prejudice. Instead, the fact that, through nature, the common man is elevated shows the great power which nature has. What kind of redemption or solace does the speaker have in the face of death? In Thomas Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. In Thomas Gray's poem, Elegy in a Country Churchyard, the author's primary focus is on the equalization of death. He notes that regardless of how important one is, all life ends in death. The common man and woman will find joy in family, but still will find death at the end of their days. Thomas Gray points out that while the common man will face death, someday, the same fate waits for those of power and importance. Gray seems to infer that it is not how one was perceived by others that matters at the end of one's life, but the manner in which a person led his or her life. Here, then, is Gray's sense of redemption, the hope or solace he finds in confronting, most likely, his own death. Gray indicates that he is a man of faith who believes in a life after the grave. This is not clearly evident until the reader reaches the section of the poem entitled The Epitaph. We might easily assume, by the end of the poem, that Gray is writing this for himself. If this is truly the case, he hopes that after death, God will find in his time on earth a life well led. The poem notes that the subject of the epitaph gains a friend in heaven, all that he wanted, which means that heaven smiled down on the man because of the good deeds he had done and the way he cared for others. The man at rest will no longer practice virtuous behavior, his frailties lie with him in the grave, both alike in trembling hope repose, both wait for judgment, hoping that the merits will be rewarded and the frailties forgiven. His spirit is hoping to be embraced by his Father and his God, one in the same. The dead man hopes that God will take him into heaven regardless of his mistakes, but mindful of all he did to please heaven while living here on earth. This is the Gray's solace, his hope, that he will be redeemed, released from blame or death. In Thomas Gray's poem, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, the speaker presents a number of different kinds of consolation or solace in the face of death. Among these kinds of comfort are the following, perhaps the most surprising aspect of this poem, especially when it is compared and contrasted to a work such as John Milton's Lycidas, is how much emphasis it places on being remembered in worldly ways by other human beings, and how little emphasis it places on the consolations of joy in heaven with God. Such repose is indeed mentioned in the final lines, but this kind of compensation would have been stressed far more strongly in earlier English poems, from the times of the Anglo-Saxons to the times of the English Renaissance. Even here, then, the emphasis seems worldly in more ways than one, and although God is mentioned or alluded to in the final two stanzas, the poem is far less overtly Christian in its message than one might have expected. In Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, Thomas Gray's attitude toward death at first is that everyone faces the same end, regardless of their social standing, a sense of importance. With many of the lines of this poem, the author notes the positions in life that the living once held, and the activities that filled their days. He compares the powerful and humble. Gray asks if a neglected spot he sees in the graveyard might hold the body of one in life who was powerful and revered. The author envisions those whose lives were filled not with greatness as it might be deemed by some, but a significant joy in the pursuit of family life. Throughout the poem, Gray notes that beauty and importance in life may be measured by a society, but that these things exist even outside that realm. Recognition by some does not measure the true nature or beauty of all things, all people, even those unnoticed, have been noteworthy. The loss of one meek poor soul is a loss much the same as that of a Milton or a Cromwell, some, in life. Moved quietly, Gray, who we can assume by the title is reflecting upon the many grave sites in a cemetery, the death of each person there deserves the passing tribute of a sigh. The poem's epitaph seems to speak to one solitary individual who was not extolled in life, and this may be the true focus of the poem. It seems that this man had little, but gave all he had to those in need, even if all he had was a tear. And God rewarded him for his soul sincere. This last segment extols the man's virtues in life, helping those less fortunate, not for the praise of others, but simply to find upon his death a place in heaven, in the bosom of his Father and his God, based upon capitalization. His Father is God. Quote, while he may be speaking of a man dedicated to finding heaven, perhaps Gray is speaking of a Christ-like figure, or even the actual person of Christ. Gray's poem says all life ends in death, regardless of how important one was in life. However, more importantly, is the kind of life led that would bring one beyond death, into heaven. While all may die, not all will go to heaven. Heaven, it would seem the author is saying, conquers death. Gray may be writing his own epitaph in the poem, with a hope of a life lived well, or he might be alluding to the truest example of the life well led, and the one who conquered death, Christ himself. The poem is a typical elegy poem. Elegy poems were mournful and lamenting, normally used in funerals. The elegy contains three specific elements: lament, praise, and then consolation. The lament section of the poem details the grief the survivor of the lost feels. The praise section offers praise for the deceased. The consolation section offers closure for the speaker regarding the loss of the loved one they are suffering from. Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard is typical of the 18th century elegy poem, just simply does not follow the sectioning of most elegies. While the beginning of the poem simply describes the surroundings of the speaker, it still details the setting of a mournful and grieving place. After describing his surroundings, the speaker begins to think about more specific thoughts about the dead, his own. Here, the poem moves into a more typical aspect seen in elegy poetry. The speaker's thoughts focus on the excesses associated with different things in the world. After the excess of the world are examined, the speaker's thoughts move to his own end and how those who have passed want to be remembered. Prior to the epitaph that ends the poem, the speaker describes the grave site of the poet whose tombstone he is standing over and the end of the life of the poet. Depending on which version of the poem you are reading, there is another stanza which precedes the epitaph. This stanza discusses the inevitable fate that all mankind will meet, death.